Dana's standing up and he's walking around the room and he's like, this is the summer of 15. And he says, I want to put Ronda Rousey. And remember, Ronda Rousey is the lead dog. She's the face of the company alongside Conor McGregor. And Dana says, I want to put Ronda Rousey against Holly Holm. And I said, Dana, who wants to see that? Ronda's going to, judo throw her down to the ground and tap her out in 30 seconds. And he said, that's what we want. And then, do you remember what happened in that fight? Ronda got knocked out.
Welcome to Sports Business Unplugged, where the real game happens off the field. No fluff, no filters, just raw, uncut stories from the pros shaping the industry. Their journeys, their challenges, their passion, straight from the source. Let's talk sports business.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Sachs, and this is Sports Business Unplugged, where we bring you raw, unfiltered conversations with the people who make the sports industry move. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome someone who's worn just about every hat in sports business. Eric Winter. Eric is currently the president and COO of Triller TV. It's a sports and entertainment platform that merges live fights with music and pop culture. But the title barely scratches the surface. He's been at the helm of Rivals.com. He guided that to become a recruiting media powerhouse, and he oversaw the launch of UFC Fight Pass, helping the UFC dive into the streaming area. He even published a book about Barry Bonds' 73 home run season back in the day, 2001. He's worked inside corporate giants like Yahoo and DIRECTV. He also started his own consulting startup and for athletes and entertainment. He's seen sports business world from every angle. In this episode, we're going to unpack his journey, his pivots, his challenges, and behind-the-scenes stories, get his take on where the industry's heading. And knowing Eric, I expect some honest, no-holds-bars insight and a good dose of humor. So grab a seat. This is going to be good. And Eric, welcome to the show.
Andrew, it's good seeing you, man. Congratulations on all your success. I'm looking forward to seeing you as a graduate, first and foremost. And I like the fact that you've entered into the pod space. So let's get this cracking.
Thank you so much. Let's just start all the way back at the beginning from SDSU days. You started as an African Studies major and a sports writer for the Daily Aztec. How did that college experience and the connections you made with Jane Hancock propel you into your first job at DIRECTV, effectively switching you from journalism to the business side of sports?
You know, it's interesting. I tell this story quite often, and people ask, why were you an African American Studies major? And the humbling truth is that I was a bad student. I couldn't take Scantrons. I couldn't do, multiple choice. My brain just didn't work that way. Kids today are a little bit more fortunate with the opportunities that they're given at not just the collegiate level, but the high school and we called it junior high school back in my day. Today it's middle school. And unfortunately and embarrassingly enough, I couldn't pass the standardized test to get into the journalism school at San Diego State University. Funny enough, I became the sports editor for 2 consecutive years. I was good enough for grammar, spelling, punctuation to teach everyone how to be great beat writers and great journalists, but I couldn't pass a test. And so I ended up, and I'm well-read and I'm a gifted writer. It's not my ego talking. I'm really, really good. And so what I could do is I took my first African American Studies class as a freshman and I aced it. I got an A+. And so then I dove right in and I found it very intriguing, very engaging. I did a lot of reading and a lot of writing in that major. So the major was a little bit easier for me, while the topics as an African American Studies major was very important and very critical, not just back then, but educational for me even today as a business person. So that's how I got started at San Diego State. And it's really funny, sad, but funny. And it's very much a conversation starter. People look at me cross-eyed. African American Studies major? That doesn't make sense. Well, it makes sense now that you know the backstory. And so Jane Hancock, rest in peace, she's not with us anymore. Jane Hancock was my mentor. She was the senior women's athletic director at San Diego State. And if you remember way back in the day, Marshall Falk was our Heisman candidate at San Diego State. And she was the one who created all the initiatives, all the marketing initiatives for the athletic department. Phil the Murph, she did Marshall's Heisman campaign. And unfortunately, Marshall lost to Gino Torretta, University of Miami quarterback, who shouldn't have won. It should have been Marshall Faulk. But what was most important is when I was the editor of the student newspaper, Jane didn't like the way me and the team were writing and covering the school, the business side of the athletic department, and the games themselves. We were a student-run newspaper, and so we took a little bit extra liberties. We truly didn't have oversight by the administration or the journalism program. We generated about $1 million a year in ad sales. This is when we were doing five issues a week, Monday through Friday. We probably had a circulation of about 10,000. So it was a meaningful business. And I share that because we felt that we were real journalists, and our competition was the San Diego Union Tribune, and we took it damn seriously. And so Jane, I got a phone call one day at 9 a.m. It was like on a Monday morning. And she said, Mr. Winter, this is Miss Hancock, Senior Women's Athletic Director. And the hairs, I had hair back then. The hairs stood up. I sat up straight in my seat. And she said, I want you to come to my office, and I want you to be here at 9 o'clock. And so I came to her office, 9 a.m. She poured me coffee, and it was in like one of these cups, Boyd's coffee, if you remember Boyd's coffee. And she started to educate me in that meeting about how it worked on the athletic side or the athletic department side. And for the next 2 years, I would meet with Jane every Monday morning at 9 a.m. and we just shot the breeze. She taught me about business. I explained to her who we were and who Matt was and Josh was and Tim was and all the writers on our side. And we had a great relationship. And fast forward, when I finished San Diego State, she had gone on to become the startup executive for a little bitty startup called DIRECTV. And so here she is building out the sports marketing team at DIRECTV. I was on a 2-year internship. At this point, I'm traveling in the Southeast. I was at the Brentwood Country Club, which is a club outside of Nashville, and for the American Junior Golf Association. And my phone rang. Yes, we had mobile phones back then, but they weren't like Blackberries. They were like old school flip phones. And I said, Jane, what's going on? And she said, it's about time you stop, goofing around on the golf tour. I need you to move to LA. And I said, for what? She said, I'm at a startup called DIRECTV and I need you here. So 2 weeks later, I hung up my golf spikes. This was before soft spikes, and joined Jane at DIRECTV. So that's a long-winded answer to your question about San Diego State, African American Studies, and Jane Hancock. And I ended up working for Jane for 10 years at DIRECTV. And unfortunately, cancer took Jane's life during COVID, at the beginning of COVID. But a lot of the words I use, a lot of the actions I take, a lot of the leadership and guidance that I give the next generation, I learned it from one person, and that was Jane Hancock.
In your years at DIRECTV in the sports division, you eventually made your way up to the head of pay-per-view operations. What were some of the challenges you faced managing, those big live events in the early days? And looking back, what skills or lessons from that period helped you when you later took on roles like at Rivals or launching the UFC Fight Pass?
So I'm going to say it that we have a lot of stories to give about DIRECTV, but just to frame my career, 10 years at DIRECTV, 10 years at Yahoo. And I managed a lot of business and services for both of those companies. And the biggest difference between DIRECTV and Yahoo was at DIRECTV, it was all about Eric Winter. And at Yahoo, it was all about the people who worked on my teams. And this isn't to discredit the leadership that Jane gave me, but it was about me as a person. I felt that I went to San Diego State and everybody on Jane's team had MBAs. I didn't have an MBA. We're talking about Harvard MBAs, the best schools in America, the smartest and the brightest minds. And I was young and immature, and I felt that it was about me and I had to continually show my worth. And while I accomplished great things at DIRECTV, as I look back at my career, I wish I was a little bit more of a better team player. That's why when I got to Yahoo, it was all about the team as opposed to the individual. And the subtle differences was because when I was at DirecTV, we were in the TV business or the cable and the satellite business. We all had offices. I was given an office at such a young age. And then when I got to Yahoo, everything was in an open environment. You worked in scrums, you worked in teams, you were forced to integrate together. I remember the days of DirecTV. You'd go to a conference room. We like to say Jane would pull the pin of the grenade, throw it, and we would all scamper back to our offices, shut the door, turn on our TV, put our feet on the desk. At Yahoo, you worked in an open environment. Nobody had offices except legal and the heads of each department. And for me, the challenge at DirecTV wasn't necessarily at DirecTV. It was by the time I got to Yahoo, I had to quickly assimilate into a different corporate environment. And one thing I'm really good at, and it's paid dividends over the years, is I'll tell you a quick funny story. Someone said to me during my days at Yahoo, I won't say who, but unfortunately I had to go through a round of layoffs and I laid off a bunch of people who didn't really deserve to be laid off, but at corporate
Yeah.
America, you're given a mandate, cut,
Yep.
and so you have to cut.
Yep.
And this gentleman said to me, he looked me in the eye. I had human resources on my right. I had legal on my left. Security was outside the conference room. That's how you handle mass layoffs.
Yep.
And the person took his severance package, took it in his hand. He stood up, and my hands were on the conference room table, and I'm waiting for what he's going to say or do. And he looked at me and he said, "The only thing you're good at is shaking hands and kissing babies." And with that, he stormed out of the conference room, took his severance, and today we're still friends on social media. But what he meant by that was he meant that you're a diplomat. And he meant, and as I went home that night and I was angry and frustrated, and I said to my wife, "I can't believe this guy said this to me." And the next morning when I woke up, as I'm making coffee, my wife at the time said to me, "He's right." And what he meant was, I'm not some product visionary. I'm not, some person who's built, killer products and services. I had learned to become a leader of men and women in a corporate environment. I had the ability to manage up as easily as I had the ability to manage down. So the challenges for me at DirecTV, I didn't really know them at DirecTV until I left it. And I wish I was a better team player early on in my career. I hope that answers your question.
It's amazing how, your next job made you realize all the things you were doing wrong at DirecTV. Just going
We
back
did
to
great. I'm sorry to cut you off. We did accomplish great things at
yes,
DirecTV. And
yes,
I don't think I answered your question clearly from a pay-per-view perspective, because that is where I'm wearing the letters and I'm
yes.
still proud of it. We accomplished great things. And I do want to talk about how UFC got back on television in the United States. We did it at DirecTV. But the answer I gave you was the challenge I had. And it's going to be for any kid like you who leaves college and enters the work world.
Yes.
You have to become a team player much quicker than I did. Now, it didn't harm my career, thankfully, but everyone always says, "I wish I knew then what I know now." So that's my answer for the challenge perspective.
Before we talk about UFC, I just want to talk about Rivals a little bit more. And when you took the helm at Rivals, when the recruiting coverage, it was exploding. What was it like trying to grow a niche sports media property with a tech giant like Yahoo? Can you just talk about how you kept Rivals competitive? And I know you say, quote, every media outlet today covers college recruiting. So can you just talk about, how you kept that competitive advantage and stood out?
So it's really interesting. I'm not a recruiting expert. I'm not a big fan. I went to San Diego State. We took everyone's leftovers and signed them, right? Although San Diego State basketball made the NCAA championship game, we lost to UConn, but that's a different story. We didn't focus on recruits or recruiting when I was a student. We didn't even think that way. The only reason why I became the CEO of Rivals.com is we bought that company in the summer of 2007, and we bought it for almost $100 million. And one of the mistakes Yahoo made, which is a mistake a lot of companies made when they acquire companies, is they don't properly integrate the acquisition into the fabric or the culture or the technology of the, I'll call it the parent company or Topco. And so in the case of Rivals, the two founders, or technically they were the second founders, they were hardcore, rabid recruiting fans. And they took an existing machine, bought it out of bankruptcy, flipped it from an ad solutions product to a subscription product, and it was a rocket ship. I want to be super clear. I was not the visionary. And the problem is they left Yahoo within 2 years of being acquired. And there was only one person at Yahoo who had any working knowledge of how the subscription business worked. And it was your friend Eric Winter, because I did 10 years at Yahoo. And so I took over the company, became the CEO of it, and I realized that we didn't have the ability to compete digitally or technically because Yahoo at this point was going through its own turbulent challenges. Yeah. Microsoft had made an acquisition offer of 45 million. They should have said yes. Because ultimately Yahoo was acquired for not 45 million, 45 billion. And ultimately Yahoo got acquired for 5 billion by Verizon. That's another story for another podcast. But the problems I had is Yahoo was going through probably 4 or 5 CEOs. That meant there were no budgets, less headcount. You didn't have the resources you needed. So I couldn't technically compete, meaning I wasn't able to build upon the killer tech or the great message boards. So the way I competed and the way I delivered for our audience is I created an offline camp program called the Rivals Camp Series. Yes. And listen, I often say that I'm the dumbest guy in the room, but I'm the smartest guy in the room when it came to creating that series. And I conceived of that thing, and today it still exists. And the reason why I created a camp combine football event series is because I wanted something where we could have all of our cameras and all of our football analysts and all of our publishers, the publisher of the Alabama site or the UCLA site or the SMU site or any of our colleges around the country. I wanted them to be able to go to an enclosed football camp or combine or event series and be able to film the on-field activities or do the interviews with the recruits that would be exclusive for our audience, exclusive behind our paywall. Yeah. And that was one of the ways that we acquired subs, retained subs, and win back subs, and then upgraded subs, upgrading them from a monthly to an annual or maybe multiple subscriptions. And frankly, it was a pretty innovative idea. And I'm really proud that even today, Rivals still has the Rivals Camp series. So I'm super proud of that.
That's awesome. What's the evolution of it from when you created it to today? How is it different?
So what's different is they've added on a lot more bells and whistles in terms of, speed and skill development and timing and data and statistics that get delivered to the kids. I had delusions of grandeur back in when I conceived of this 2011. We launched it in 2012. I partnered with Catapult Sports based out of Australia. It's really funny. I met the CEO of Catapult Sports at Yale University, a San Diego State guy. I got to speak at Harvard Law School and I spoke at Yale, but I met the CEO of Catapult Sports and told him what I do. And I said, I want data, I want analytics. And I said, I want to know how fast a football releases from a quarterback's hand. I said to him, we're sitting in the back of a bus going from one venue to the next at Yale. No, not Yale, Princeton. I went to Harvard and Princeton, and I'm sitting in the back of the bus, and I said to the guy, I want to know the breakaway speed from the wide receiver to the DB. I want to know the closing speed from the DB to the wide receiver. And I want the breakaway speed of a running back to a linebacker, O-line to D-line. And if you know Catapult Sports, they would have the rugby players in Australia wearing the bras, the male bras that soccer players and rugby players were. Well, there's a big chip about the size of a small iPhone that goes on to the right below the base of the skull. And so Catapult Sports, he sent all of his technicians and they all came to the Rivals Camp Series, and we forced all these athletes, like we're talking 5-star and 4-star football players, to wear these sports bras, and we started capturing the data. And unfortunately, it was very expensive, very cumbersome. It was only 13 years ago, but 13 years ago was like a whole different generation of the capturing of technology. And so the answer to your question is today, the Rivals Camp Series, they have cameras and times and splits and the collection of data and the aggregation of it. I just don't know how they use it, but there are more sponsors, better revenues, which is what it's supposed to be. I wouldn't want to sit here and say the Camp Series is worse than when I ran the company. No, it's actually gotten better, which is the way things need to be.
So you spent 20 plus years at a traditional media and in that space, and then all of a sudden you made the jump to UFC to build out Fight Pass. I'm curious, what drew you to the UFC opportunity? How did the culture shock of moving from a Yahoo, a corporate environment, to the UFC? It's fast paced, high energy, it's fight centric. How did that manifest for you?
So it's interesting. When I was at when I was at DirecTV, I was given, Jane called me, remember, she called me and said, you need to come to El Segundo. I'm like, where the hell is El Segundo? So I moved to LA. She handed me a $2 million check, not for me, not for my pocket. But if you remember at the very beginning, I said, I'm very good with the pen and I'm good on the typewriter. But we don't call it typewriters anymore. But she said, Eric, I want you to create a sports magazine. She said at the time, I'm going back to 1997. She said, this was really before the internet was, taken in by the consumer base. She said, Eric, I want you to create a sports magazine, and we're going to send it for free to all the sports subscription purchasers on DirecTV's platform. NFL Sunday Ticket, NBA League Pass, NHL Center Ice, MLB Extra Innings. We had about 2 million subscribers to all these sports platforms. DirecTV was a monster. And she gave me $2 million a year, and I created a killer sports magazine. And it was all about the intention was to entertain, to educate, and to entice.
Yes.
And I had earned the privilege after crushing it. We did about 50 million in revenue because I then got into the TV guide space. We had big guides that would sit on your coffee table. Like this is well before the internet, man.
Yeah.
Or true usage of the internet. And probably in 2000, 3 years in, Jane said, I want you to run the pay-per-view event marketing business. That meant that anything non-theatrical. So we're talking boxing, wrestling, UFC. There was a lot of comedy shows. There was Girls Gone Wild, which, today it's like product you don't want to associate yourself with. But we were selling hundreds of thousands of pay-per-views a week with all this random content. And I remember a woman named Angelina Watkins walked into my office. So I ran the pay-per-view side. She walked into my office, and she doesn't get enough credit because she needs to. And she goes, hey, Eric, I want you to watch this VHS. It was a VHS, if you know what that is. I had a machine, popped it into my machine, and it was UFC. And I, as God is my witness, I was like this, goodness gracious. But we're talking, she was showing me stuff from 1994 all the way through the year 2000. And it was the UFC prior to being acquired by Lorenzo, Frank, and Dana. Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta and Dana White. And so she said, Eric, I want to put UFC on as a pay-per-view. And this was at the point where Lorenzo and Frank had acquired it out of bankruptcy. John McCain, 5 years prior or 3 years prior, had called it human cockfighting, and it was kicked off US television. Well, hello, we put it back on. And so Dana and I have known each other since we both had full heads of hair. Maybe it wasn't full, but we did have hair.
Yeah.
And so I've known Dana and Lorenzo since 2001. And when we put not only UFC, but we put Pride Fighting on pay-per-view as well. We crushed it. I'm talking about millions and millions and millions of buys. And so fast forward, I get recruited to go to Yahoo. And who's the person who's recruiting me? Who became my boss? He was the head of Yahoo Sports because Yahoo Sports was going through a retransformation of their business. His name is Jimmy Pitaro, who today is the chairman and CEO of ESPN. And so he's been the chairman and CEO since 2017, I believe. And so Jimmy called me. He said, Eric, I want you to take over the NFL, the NFLPA. I want you to do this, 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 and this. And I raised my hand and I said, hey, boss, I've written a business plan for us to get into the combat sports space. And I still have the PowerPoint presentation because in 2007, I pitched the UFC on Yahoo building its own technical infrastructure to deliver digital pay-per-views around the world.
Yes.
And I secured a 5-year global right to all the UFC pay-per-views. And I'm very proud of it. And the gentleman who built the the team who built the technology were a bunch of developers, but the person who led the front end and the creative is a gentleman named Ed Liu, who I stay in contact with to this day. He built the most beautiful front end of our UFC digital experience. Did I have the vision of what is now known as UFC Fight Pass? No, but we built, and I had the vision for being the first company in the world of getting into the streaming space for UFC's products and services. So fast forward to 2013, we lose the rights. Why? Because we never innovated on our technology. And I get a phone call in the beginning of 14. It said, Eric, can you come to Vegas? I want you to present to the UFC executive team all about the subscription business, how subscription business works. I remember I went to their offices on Sahara Avenue and they were bored. Everyone in that room was bored. And I had a suit and tie on. I'm giving a presentation on how you acquire and retain subs. No one gave a flying hoot of what I was saying. But 9 months later, I got a phone call that said, we want you to be the first employee of UFC Fight Pass. And I said, yes, ran the business, 3-year contract. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. And then I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but to this day, Lorenzo and Dana are still clients of mine through my consulting practice because I sold them a completely different company during COVID. But I guess my UFC experience, my UFC Fight Pass experience, my DIRECTV experience, it all goes back to it's not about what you know, it's who you know.
Yes.
And don't ever forget the people. I don't know who's listening to your pod, Andrew, but my message to anyone whoever's listening to it is when you shake someone's hand, you stay in contact with them. We may lose contact with each other for a few months. Reach back out. You stay in contact with someone and you show respect along the way, you're always going to maintain a healthy business relationship.
I mentioned this on my last episode. I feel an even better way to say it is it's not what you know or who you know, it's who will vouch for you. And I think that definitely has an impact on me, and I love to talk about that too.
Yep.
You were the first employee at Fight Pass, and you were tasked with the idea of global streaming for MMA. What do you think were the biggest hurdles in getting Fight Pass off the ground and convincing fans to, embrace streaming, when it was just getting back started in 2015?
So I want to make sure I give the UFC a lot of credit. There's 3 people who deserve an inordinate amount of credit for the creation of what is known as, or the product as, UFC Fight Pass. Ed Muncie. Most people don't know the name and they'll never know the name. He's one of the brightest people I've ever come across in business. He and I went to college together. He was a Sigma Nu, I was a ZBT. Don't worry, we're friends. But he was the head of all the technology and digital for UFC. And then Marshall Zelaznik, who was the president of International. And then there was Stephen Tecci, who's a brilliant data scientist, who today technically runs Fight Pass. But those 3 are just, you asked early on, what was it like going from corporate America to fast moving machine? Well, you want to know something? These guys were just as bright if not even brighter than anyone I'd ever worked with the previous 20 years. Stephen Tecci, I would put him up against any data scientist in the business today. That man could do forecasting within a millimeter of what the buys actually would be. He could begin forecasting an event 60 days out and tell you within a couple thousand buys how it's going to perform based on a variety of factors and data inputs. Like, these people at the UFC are brilliant, even though back then it was a super small team. I had the ability to work with them seamlessly because we all love UFC, we all
Yeah.
love combat sports, but more importantly, it's like, holy smokes, we work in sports. How can you not want to wake up in the morning and give it your all? So that's it, man. It was the UFC folks are incredible.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Do you have any crazy behind the scenes stories or anything that's happened that you can share with the audience
From
at
UFC
UFC?
or
At UFC.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because I've been a fan of UFC for a really long time. Even though the first time I saw it, I was like, I didn't make that noise, but it was close.
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate at UFC. I was one of the top executives there. So I was in the weekly executive meetings with Lorenzo and Dana every Monday. And then every Tuesday, I was in the matchmaker meeting. And that is as privileged as it gets. And for me, I felt the first couple months, I felt like a fan more than I felt like an executive. And it's funny because even me, I was 20 years into my career at this point. I embarrassed myself in a matchmaker meeting. Dana's standing up and he's walking around the room and he's like, this is the summer of 15. And he says, I want to put Ronda Rousey. And remember, Ronda
Yeah.
Rousey is the lead dog. She's the face of the company alongside Conor McGregor. And Dana says, I want to put Ronda Rousey against Holly Holm. And Dana, to his credit, and Lorenzo, to his credit, would go around the room and ask people their opinion. And when it came to me, I remember exactly where I was sitting and I remember exactly what I said. I said, Ronda's going to just, because Holly Holm is a former boxer and a stand up queen, right? She was like, could knock people out with the best of them. And I said, Dana, who wants to see that? Ronda's going to, judo throw her down to the ground and tap her out in 30 seconds. And he said, that's what we want. And then, do you remember what happened in that fight? Ronda got knocked out. So, like, it was a double whammy because as a fan, people wanted to see Mike Tyson knock out his opponent in the first round. And that's what Ronda Rousey was doing. My answer in the matchmaker meeting was, I don't want to see another armbar in 30 seconds. I wanted to see a good, compelling 50-50 sort of fight. And then egg on my face, Dana's like, every fan wants to see the armbar in 30 seconds. And then the worst thing happened for our company. Ronda gets knocked out. And I mean knocked out unconscious. So that was kind of embarrassing, to say the least.
That's a great story.
Don't tell anyone. Make sure that's not public.
Another story or another video I saw is a while back you had an interview with Ariel Helwani when the Fight Pass came out and you guys broke all the records. Can you just tell me about that experience when you just saw the numbers coming in and just how many people were watching?
Yeah, so Lorenzo Fertitta deserves a lot of credit because one thing about Dana and Lorenzo's relationship, yeah, they're good friends behind the scenes, but sometimes friends don't make good business bedfellows. And those two could finish each other's sentences. And the one thing I'll always give Dana and Lorenzo credit for is, yeah, Dana gets all the credit creatively and Lorenzo on the business side, but they looked around the executive room and asked people their opinion and allowed us to have a seat at the table. I remember I was in Mammoth this winter. I'm in Mammoth Mountain, winter break 2015. I get a phone call. It says, Eric, you asked for it, you got it. We're going to give you, because I always wanted a UFC Fight Pass exclusive, meaning I wanted A-level athletes on our itty-bitty platform as opposed to having these A-list athletes get put on pay-per-view or headlining Fox. Because remember, this is in the Fox days, not ESPN days. And I get on, it was a conference call on Christmas Eve. They had James Elliott, the head of UFC Europe, me, Dana, and Lorenzo. And they said, all right, Eric, we're giving you what you want. And I'm like, what's that? And they said, we're giving you Michael Bisping against Anderson Silva, exclusive on Fight Pass. And it was 2 months later. And if you know anything, Anderson Silva was just a legend and still is, like, Hall of Famer. And Michael Bisping was the count. Like, Michael Bisping was the man. Not only that, but they put this event live at the O2 Arena.
Yep.
And for us, on one hand, you can't just pat yourself on the back. Yay, I got two A-list athletes who can draw eyeballs, who could sell tickets and sell pay-per-views.
Yep.
I had to now sell subscriptions. And I remember that event clearly to this day because we broke so much records, but also our technology was pretty damn stable.
Yeah.
For as many concurrent users as we had, and for as many fans came through the front door to pay for a subscription to Fight Pass in order to have the privilege to watch the live event from the UK.
Yeah.
And I remember being interviewed by Ariel. Ariel and I have been friends for a really long time. I actually tried getting him hired at Yahoo, but the dummies at Yahoo editorial team wouldn't hire him because no one believed in combat sports back then. Egg on their face. And I remember the interview clearly because I can't give you the numbers, but we absolutely slayed it. Crushed it with peak concurrence, total eyeballs, even post 24 hours, the amount of people who woke up the next morning. Because if you don't remember, Michael Bisping got knocked out at the end of round 4, end of round 3 or end of round 4, and the ref waved off the knockout. And then Michael Bisping continued the fight. It went to a decision, and he won and beat Anderson Silva. And so that's what you want, because you don't want just a slobber knocker. You don't want just a random hug fest. That fight had everything. It had two legends. It had controversy and a crazy decision. And we broke records, and I'm sure they've broken that record since then. But it was a really fun time being at UFC because... And here's something funny, which a lot of bosses forget to do. It's give the freedom to your staff. Give them the opportunity to be creative and don't just force them to do whatever's on the roadmap. I had this call this morning with my staff. Someone set up a meeting with me today and they're like, I want to talk social media. And they were really nervous. And I said to him at the end of the call, I said, listen, kid, I said, I want you to have, and I reinforced this point. I said, 10% of your day should be creative. It shouldn't be what your job description is. You want to do something, you lay out your case, I'm going to give you the green light to do it. And that's what Dana and Lorenzo allowed us to do at the UFC more than anyone at Yahoo, frankly. And it was if you were just a rank and file employee. But the UFC was a tremendous place to work with. Creative, because you always had to be on your front foot 52 weeks a year.
Crazy how it changes. Your experience at UFC was so much different than your experience at Yahoo and your experience at Rivals. Just crazy career transitions. I know you've worked at so many different sports media properties. I have a quote. You have unmatched experience in developing emerging programming platforms. That's what somebody said about you. And I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest misconception people have about working in sports media at a high level?
You know, here's the funny fun. I remember my first week on the job at UFC. Now, you got to remember, I was a UFC fan from 2001, forced fan, became a fan. I've probably been to, no joke, 200 events, 200 live events. And when I was a fan, I would always come in on Friday and watch the live weigh-ins. And that's a spectacle in itself. The press conferences on Thursdays are a spectacle, live weigh-ins on Friday, and then the Saturday event. So as a fan, I would come in and I couldn't wait to go to the weigh-ins. A tight 30-minute or a 1-hour tight live show. And I remember my first week on the job, I was in Brazil watching Ronda Rousey she knocked out Betch Correa. And then I fly back Monday morning and we have work week. And guess what? We have a big event that Friday. Or maybe it's a week later, who knows? But Friday morning, I go around to my peers and I'm like, hey, it's Friday. I said, who wants to go to the weigh-ins with me? Remember, I had my fan mentality hat on, and people went like this. Why do you want to go to the weigh-ins? And I'm like, of course, I always embarrass myself, but I'm like, the weigh-ins, let's go to the weigh-ins. And so the point I'm making is the misconception is everyone wants to work in sports, but you got to take your sports fan hat off because it's business. It's business 24 hours a day. The byproduct of working in sports is you get the lanyard and the press credential, right? You get your credential and you're like, hey, I work for UFC or NFL or the Miami Dolphins, whatever. But you're not there to be a fan. You're there to service your fan.
Mm-hmm.
Big difference. You're not there as a fan. You're there to service the fan. And that fan is the ticket buyer, the person who purchases a consumer product, a plush product, or a t-shirt or a jersey, or someone who's watching highlights on your YouTube channel, or someone who's paying for a NFL Sunday ticket. Like, when you work in sports, it's not about you. It's about the millions of people who are coming in the front door of a variety of ways that they can be a fan of your team or your league or your sport. It's a really important lesson anyone needs to learn when they work in sports.
I love that quote. Definitely resonates. Definitely going to resonate with a lot of other people that work in sports. I want to go a little bit broad here, jump a little bit forward to 2017 when you stepped away from the corporate executive track, and then you became a consultant advisor to dozens of sports and entertainment ventures like Big League Pillows, Big Shots, and you were a 4-year advisor at SeatGeek. Can you just first talk about some of those clients and then how that was and why you decided to make that leap? Why you unexpectedly you went to consulting, and on the flip side, what new perspective did it give you on the sports industry?
You know, it's interesting. I never thought that I would end up being a consultant because as a consultant, you don't know where your next check comes from. And for 23 years, I got paid every 2 weeks. And I had free coffee in the break room. And at UFC, I had access to the executive kitchen and a meal whenever I wanted. But when I became a consultant, I had been traveling around the world. And here comes the world's smallest violin. But I remember coming home from a business trip, and my kids were waiting for me. And at this point, 2017, my kids were 10 and 7 at that point. So they grew up with me traveling around the world. And I came home and my daughter had a sign. She made a big poster. She's holding this big giant poster on a little girl's body. Now we're going back quite a few years before 17, but it resonated with me. And it was a picture of a mommy stick figure holding the hand of a girl stick figure holding the hand of a little boy, which signified mommy, my daughter Tilly, and my son Henry. And up in the corner was an airplane and a circle with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. And that was daddy. And so that was my kid's vision of who daddy was. I
Yeah.
wasn't holding mommy's hand or my daughter's or my son's hand. And it really hit me. And it's funny because for 8 years, I probably made 20% of what I made in the corporate world because DIRECTV and Yahoo were both publicly traded companies. I was very fortunate to have a salary, a bonus structure, stock options, and restricted stock units.
Mm-hmm.
And when I became a consultant, I tell people I became a dad again.
Yeah, yeah.
And I learned how to become a father and a parent. And my friends to this day make fun of me because I started making breakfasts and lunches and snacks and dinners. And I would post it on social media. Or old guys like me, we use Facebook. My kids aren't on Facebook. And I remember friends would say to me, stop making us look bad because I'm the guy in the kitchen and cleaning up. But I became a dad again and learned how to become a dad. But I probably missed out on a lot of money over an 8-year period. And it's sort of like I recharged my batteries. But because of all my relationships, I had the ability to have so many different clients. I started a 4-year term as an advisor to the founders of SeatGeek, which I'm very fortunate, thank my lucky stars, because they're going to go public soon. And I had Scott Coker as a client, advising him through his acquisition of his company by the PFL. He was the CEO of Bellator and the promoter of Bellator. He had already sold Strikeforce for almost $50 million to the UFC. So I've known Scott for a long time. I took on a lot of other clients, including Top Rank Boxing, and I did my own event operations overseas. Didn't work out too well, but I've had more, as a consultant, probably more failures than wins. But one of the biggest successes I had was just a year and a half ago. I had Monterrex as a client. Monterrex is a lifestyle brand out of Liverpool in the UK. And it was two kids in their 20s who had started a clothing brand, their own money. They didn't raise a damn dollar. And just 3 days ago, I'll tell you what I did for them. But 3 days ago, they just were named, both of them, to the Forbes Third 30 for 2025. Well, I met them in the summer of 23, and I flew out to Liverpool, hung out with them, pitched them an idea of doing their first ever activation in the United States. And I produced a big TV event for them with three of the biggest UFC athletes and Laura Sanko, who is the first female play-by-play. And I did a live event activation for them in front of hundreds of fans. And it was really important because I'm not going to make millions off of it. But what I did is I made a lifelong friendship with two innovative young men who at the time were 28 and a half years old.
Yep.
Okay. When you're 30 under 30 and you run a business that does 100 million a year, you're doing something right. Well, in my old age, I'm always going to have to call upon people if I ever need to. And then another friend of mine is a co-owner of Bagel Mania in Vegas. I know it sounds silly, but it's the world's biggest bagel joint. And it's a big Jewish delicatessen right across the street from the Las Vegas Convention Center. And he had acquired the rights and created the first ever World Bagel Eating Championship. And he called me out of the blue in the summer of 23, same time frame. And he said, Eric, I just signed Joey Chestnut to become a contestant at the second annual World Bagel Eating Championships. Can you help me produce a show for TV? And I produced a live event for him that was incredible. And it's the first time and only time I ever worked with Joey Chestnut. But I got to do, as a consultant, I got to do a lot of cool, innovative things that I may not have done if I was, at corporate America. And so it was time. And now my daughter's a senior and my son's a ninth grader. My daughter doesn't talk to me except send a check to this university or send a check to that university that I'm applying to. But for those 8 years, I really needed it more for me than I probably needed it for my kids. But we both needed it. And that's why I like to say I came and sat down as opposed to working in corporate America.
I want to shift a little bit to your culture philosophy, your leadership style. I know this is a quote that'll resonate with you. To know that you do not know is best. To pretend when one does not know is a disease. And I just am curious, you've led teams at big organizations and tiny startups. What kind of team culture do you try to build as a leader? How has your leadership style evolved from Yahoo to UFC and now Triller?
So the quote you read is from Lao Tzu. He's the father of Taoism, and he wrote it. That quote is inside of the second most widely read book in the world, second to the Bible. It's called the Tao Te Ching. And I read that quote in college because I took a religious studies class, and I learned about a variety of religions, including Taoism and Islam and other non-Judaic religions. I grew up Jewish, but to me, religion was fascinating. And the leaders of each religion, including Muhammad from an Islamic perspective. And that quote resonated with me. And it's really important. Now, here I am as the old guy on the podcast. You young people better listen. But you never want to be wrong. When you're young, my first 10 years at DIRECTV, it was about me. I had to prove I did this PowerPoint. It's my idea. And a lot of young people have a hard time raising their hand and saying, I just don't know. And For me, that quote, it goes like this: to know that you do not know is best. To pretend to know when one does not know is a disease. The sage is free from this disease because he recognizes this disease to be as a disease, therefore he is free from it. That's my interpretation of that quote. And his point is that don't pretend, don't be more than that you think that you are. It's okay to say, I don't know. I'm going to get the answer for you. And I actually learned that lesson during my days at DirecTV because my ego was like, I know the answer. And I would come up with something that was meaningless or immaterial to what was being asked in the boardroom with these super high level and high functioning executives. And it taught me it's okay not to know. It's okay to take a step back. And it's okay for what I like to tell a lot of people, less is more. And that answer, less is more, dovetails into my management style. Now, whether people like it or not is up to them. But my style is less is more. I don't want people writing me long frickin' emails. I don't have time to read your emails that are 15 paragraphs deep. I'm guilty of it even to this day. I do my best to communicate in bullet point style. And that's the way I want people to communicate with me, because I'll tell you a funny story why, but I find it to be effective for me and I find it to be effective for you. If you can get your point across in 3 to 5 words, you're going to get it across much easier than 3 to 5 sentences, or certainly 3 to 5 paragraphs, which the majority of the people try to do because they try to pound their chest. And I was guilty of it a long time ago. But it's funny, and I got that lesson because I remember when I first got the nerve to call girls on the telephone. Remember when phones were attached to the wall and they had these long cords?
Yep.
Well, I didn't know what to say to girls when I would call them when I was 13. And I would take a piece of paper and I would write 10 things that I wanted to talk about. And you got to remember, you're not talking on FaceTime because there was no FaceTime. You would wrap yourself up in the cord while talking to somebody. But I had a pen in my hand or a pencil, number 2 pencil, Scantron, and I would scratch off every time, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite movie? Whatever it was, but it was bullet points. And I taught myself that was the best way I could effectively communicate. Yeah, I was 13 years old trying to talk to a girl when I'd had no confidence to talk to them in person. But that bullet point philosophy has paid dividends for me all throughout my career. And it's my communication style. And I expect people to communicate with me in that style. Not because I'm Eric and I'm their boss, but because you need to adapt to environments. Your next boss after Eric Winter may love prose and poetry of 55-page memos, but not me. And you have to adapt to who your audience is. That's my answer.
Yeah, I like less is more, and it's okay to not know. But now I want to move on to something that you do know, and that's Triller TV. And I just want to know what excites you about this platform and what's the intersection of sports and entertainment. What's your plans on, merging combat sports, music, pop culture in a way that engages fans? You did it at UFC, and where do you see the sports media industry headed in the next 5 years?
So it's two big questions there. So Triller TV is formerly known as FITE.TV, and it is a homegrown built technology from ridiculously brilliant developers out of Sofia, Bulgaria. Well, they were the competition to UFC Fight Pass, not at the high level, but the technology. You got to remember, UFC Fight Pass was built on New Lion technology, EU technology, New Lion. And that was a company based out of Canada, publicly traded, but their headquarters were in New York, blah, blah, blah. It was a janky technology, which is called Endeavor Streaming today. The Fight product was homegrown and built by these smart guys, and I was always envious of what they built. Well, fast forward to 2021. At the end of 2021, Fight got acquired for $52 million by a company called Triller. Triller itself had already raised $400 million. And so fast forward to the beginning of 2024, I thought I was going to be a consultant for the rest of my life, making peanuts. And I got a phone call from the founder of Fight, and who at this point had started up another company, and he has 700 employees all throughout the Baltics.
Yes.
He said, Eric, I need you to run the company for me because we're going to go through a reverse merger with another publicly traded company. We're going to come out on the other side as a public entity. So today, Triller TV is one of 4 divisions of a publicly traded company. And the 4 are a financial services company out of Hong Kong. Doesn't really matter. Number 2 is something called the Triller app. They tried to be the competitor to ByteDance or Musically, if you remember that.
I remember.
Which turned into TikTok. Well,
Yep.
Triller app lost that game.
Yep.
But now with Congress and our government considering TikTok to possibly be banned in the US, Triller app has an opportunity to take market share here in the US. And then the other 2 assets that Triller public company owns is Triller TV, the sports streaming platform, and a company called Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. And so I've known the founder and promoter of BKFC a long time, David Feldman. He is no different than Dana White. They're direct, honest, no BS about them. They're visionaries for their sport. BKFC, listen, it's a little bit on the appearance, it's a little bit more brutal because it's bare knuckle. I'm not a fan of using the words bare knuckle. I'm a believer in brand. You don't see Dana saying Ultimate Fighting Championship. You see Dana saying UFC. And so my vision and my belief is we need to call it BKFC. And I believe, and David Feldman believes, that Triller TV and BKFC need to be together, one entity, because now you're talking about UFC and UFC Fight Pass version 2, and the opportunities are enormous. So I got the phone call in January of 24, and we didn't go public until October of 24. And listen, it's not easy being a publicly traded company, but there's enough smart people that are associated with this company that hopefully we can make it through the turbulent times and come out the other side with really killer products and services. Cross your fingers, say your prayers for us, but we've got good men and women that are associated with all these companies all around the world.
I want to talk about relationships. I know you mentioned earlier that relationships are really important to you. I just want to know, is there a story or a moment in your career where a relationship made all the difference?
I'm going to say 2 things. I'm going to give you both sides of the coin. I remember when I left, I remember when I left the UFC, I had already been invited to be a panelist at a big industry conference. And I was ready to go, and I had my flights booked, knew where I was going to stay. I was going to have my dinners and have fun at these conferences, or at this specific conference. And I had left in February. The conference was in April. And I got a phone call in March, and it said, "Oh, Eric, we just recognized that you're not with UFC anymore. We're going to pull you off the panel." And I was in shock. I was like, "But I'm Eric Winter. Like, you don't pull me off the panel." And I was a little bit in shock because at that point, it wasn't about you anymore. Like, you're Eric Winter, and UFC and Yahoo and DirecTV are in the rear view mirror. And it was a hard pill to swallow for me. I understood why the sports industry conference needed someone who was at a league or a team and was a high-ranking executive. And for me, even though I knew everyone, it wasn't good enough for that moment. On the flip side, my relationships with Dana and Lorenzo paid dividends 3 years after I left the UFC. Now, mind you, this was almost 20 years of knowing them. Lorenzo gave me a phone call at the beginning of COVID. Or actually, I called him. I was coming into town, and during the summer, June of 2020, I was going into Vegas, and I called and I said, "Hey, I'm coming in town. I'm going to stay at the Green Valley Ranch." And he said, "Let's talk. I want to talk business." Now, you got to remember the lockdowns, March, April, May, big old lockdowns. Lorenzo and his brother owned 20 plus casinos. They tapped into their line of credit and paid every single one of their employees their salaries, kept them on the books. Okay. So he had bigger things to worry about than little old Eric Winter calling him out of the blue during COVID.
Yep.
And we got on the phone and we started talking, and he said, Eric, let's go buy rivals.com. And I went, what? He said, I'll put up the money, you buy the business, negotiate the deal, and then you'll operate the company. And the reason why it was important to him is because even though I was doing a lot of business with UFC when I was running Rivals, both of Lorenzo's kids played collegiate football. One of them, Nico, was a 4-year starter for Notre Dame. And Nico had come through the Rivals Camp Series. I had to keep Lorenzo outside. He wasn't allowed to be on the inside. He had to stay with the parents. But Lorenzo says to me in the summer of 2020, you go out, let's buy it. And my response to him was, I have a better idea. I have a vision, and I'm going to write the business plan and I'm going to present it to you. Well, my vision was to get into the youth sports space, and I wanted to acquire these 7 companies. And here was my ego. We have to acquire them all to do this, 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 and this. And I brought out the founder and CEO of the first company on my list. And I flew him to Vegas in, I think, August 20th. That's the date I remember, 19th or 20th of 2020. 84 days later, the money hit the bank. Lorenzo, Dana, and Fertitta Capital at that point, they're now named Fiumi Capital, acquired the company called 3Step Sports. 3Step Sports was the company I hired to operate the Rivals Camp Series back in 2012.
Crazy.
And at this point, 2 million kids were coming through the 3Step camps and combines and tournaments and events. And so my relationship paid off with Lorenzo and Dana. They believed in me enough to where I wrote the business plan, they signed off on it, and I had a 1-year engagement with Fiumi Capital for how the acquisition would work and how they would manage that business. And so for me, I can't stress enough, loyalty and friendship sort of go hand in hand. If anyone, no one ever says anything bad about Lorenzo. Everyone says something bad about Dana. I will defend both of them till the day I die. To this day, Dana will reply to my texts within minutes. And he's one of the most powerful people in sports. I owe a lot to both of those men, and I'm loyal to the day till I leave this earth.
Love that. And it's insane how 3Step comes back after you're working with them at Rivals, and then you bring the CEO and it all comes together. That's an amazing story. I love to hear that.
And they wrote the check and the money hit the bank 84 days after I flew the founder out to Vegas to meet Lorenzo and Dana.
That's insane. Wow.
That's how
I
it works.
just want to, it works. It works. I want to ask you some rapid fire questions here.
Yep.
Just a little bit of a fun thing. What's the greatest UFC fight or moment you've ever witnessed live?
So the first UFC event I ever went to was UFC 43. I sat in the 3rd row behind Vanilla Ice. And the reason is because the UFC had hired him to write Chuck Liddell's walkout song. Not write it, but they were going to use Ice Ice Baby because Chuck Liddell was known as the Iceman.
Yep.
And so Chuck Liddell was this, and they put Chuck against Randy Couture. Randy, he was the American hero, and Chuck was supposed to win. And Chuck actually got TKO'd, I believe, in round 3. And everyone was deflated because, holy shit, what was going to happen now? Like, it's all about matchmaking. And Chuck Liddell, they put all their money into Chuck and all the promotional excellence that Dana and team are known for. Chuck walks out to Ice, Ice, Baby. And so for me, here I am representing UFC, DIRECTV at the time. And we were like, oh my God. But the buys had already happened. We had made millions of dollars off the pay-per-view. And what the UFC was damn good at was making stars. And so, but to me, that was my best DIRECTV experience. The second best UFC DIRECTV experience. My second best one is, sadly, Chuck Liddell once again, when I was pitching my Yahoo executives, Jimmy Pitaro
Yep.
the chairman and CEO, who at this point was only the vice president of sports at Yahoo. I flew him and some other staff out to go see Chuck Liddell fighting Rampage Jackson. At this point, man alive, I'm going to forget which one it was, but it was May of 2007. May of 2007. You can figure out which event it was. Jimmy is sitting cage side with Dana. Chuck Liddell he's supposed to beat Rampage because Rampage had beat Chuck already in Pride. And so guess what happens again? Chuck gets knocked out with that left hook that Rampage was known for. And for me, it's like, I'm bad luck. I never wanted to go to another Chuck Liddell fight because he only loses when I'm there. So for me, those were two of the most memorable experiences. And I know it's a long time ago, but that's that.
Something else that's a long time ago. Should Barry Bonds be in the Hall of Fame? Yes or no?
100% yes.
Okay. What's your all-time favorite sports film?
Rudy.
You could attend any sporting event or game from history. Which one would you pick?
From history. Wow, that's a really good one. I would want to see the Miami Dolphins winning the Super Bowl where they went 17-0 to be then and today the only undefeated NFL team in history.
What's the coolest city or country you got to visit while working in sports?
The most interesting is the United Arab Emirates. The coolest is Paris.
When you're not working, what's a hobby or activity that people might be surprised to learn you enjoy?
Cooking.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
Steak in a cast iron grill. And I've got my new IQ, Chef IQ. It's the probe that goes into all the types of meats that you have. It's the best invention ever.
Shout out to Chef IQ.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cage side at a UFC title fight or 50-yard line at the Super Bowl? Which one do you pick?
Cage side all day long.
Okay, last one here. Fill in the blank. If I wasn't in the sports business world, I'd probably be
a waiter at Spaghetti Factory.
Oh, yeah, that's in San Diego.
Yes, that's in San Diego.
Okay.
And I was a waiter at Spaghetti Factory in college.
I want to ask you one final question just to wrap it up. So you've seen so many people chase this industry. Some make it, some don't. What separates the ones who succeed from the ones who fade out? And what advice would you give to young people trying to break into the industry?
It's what I went through, and it's the story I told about DIRECTV versus Yahoo. There is no I in team. The faster you learn how to become a team player in any environment, I don't care whether you work at Main Chick Hot Chicken, the best hot chicken place here in LA, or you work at Starbucks, or if you work at Yahoo or any company in the world. The faster you integrate and understand all your teammates and how you all have to row together, same motion as you proceed with whatever you're doing in business, the faster you learn that, the faster you become better as your own brand, and you become a better teammate and people trust you.
Awesome. Well, that's all I have for you. Great conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Excellent. I wish you all the best of luck. And listen, anyone who listens to this podcast, you can reach out to me. I'm going to give you my email address right now. ericwinter@yahoo.com. ERICWINTER@yahoo.com. And I'll be more than happy to help you along the way.
Eric Winter, I'm sure on LinkedIn and Twitter too, if they want to reach out to you and look at some of your stuff. Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for watching. This was a great conversation. You guys should all love this advice. It's great advice. And you can follow us at Sports Business Unplugged, Instagram, and listen to us on Spotify. Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Bye.